Afternoon, everybody. I think we're going to make a start, but Alex, if you could let anybody else in from the lobby, if they're trying to join, that would be really appreciated. So welcome, everybody, to the second of our Cyber Foundation series webinars. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. This particular webinar is looking at firewalls and internet gateways. If you don't already know me, I'm Claire Harrett, and I sit in the Solutions Architecture team here at SAPO. And I'm joined by my colleague Andre, who is a solutions engineer at Netscope. So for those of you that were with us for a previous webinar, we looked at some recent stats from the government's cyber breaches survey. And that showed that actually only a small percentage of UK businesses and charities hold Cyber Essentials or Cyber Essentials Plus certification. That's despite around 2/3 of all organisations experiencing some form of cyber attack in the UK last year. So SAPO have developed a Cyber Foundations assessment, which we talked about a lot on our previous webinar. If you missed that, you can actually see the recording on the events page of our website. But essentially, that Cyber Foundations assessment helps organisations understand where they are and are not meeting the standards for Cyber Essentials, and also where their controls meet the wider best practices laid out in the CIS 18. So today's webinar, we're specifically going to be looking at the firewalls requirements of the Cyber Essentials scheme. Throughout history, when we were building our homes, villages and towns, we've sought to create a layer of defence to maintain our safety and keep threats out. And that might have been done by building our village on a hill, building boundary walls, digging out moats, building strong front doors, deploying armed guards, dogs, that sort of thing. But in the cyber world, rather than our physical safety and our material possessions, it's obviously the data that cyber criminals are after. So how do we meet the firewall requirements of Cyber Essentials? Well, the aim of this particular requirement is to make sure that only secure and necessary network services can be accessed from the internet. And it applies to boundary firewalls, desktop computers, laptops, routers, servers, and also IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS services. So let's start by having a look at traditional network topology then. So your boundary firewall obviously controls traffic between the internet and your local area network, blocking threats. The software firewall will control traffic between the internet and the device itself. So that sort of firewall might be necessary if you don't own the network to which your devices are connecting. So something like a WeWork office, for example. Software firewalls are quite good in the sense that they allow more tailored rules than a perimeter firewall, but it does create a bit of administrative overhead managing all of those software firewall rules. Nowadays as well, most desktop and laptop operating systems come with a software firewall pre-installed, so we would advise just to use that. But let's have a look at the firewall requirements of Cyber Essentials in more detail and in context. So Cyber Essentials says that you must change default admin passwords to a strong and unique password or disable remote access entirely. You need to prevent remote access to the admin panel unless there's a clear and documented business need, and you either layer that with MFA or a small allowed IP range that can access from remotely. You need to block unauthenticated inbound connections by default. You need to ensure that the firewall rules are approved and documented by an authorized person, and that documentation includes the business need for the rule. So you need to justify the rule essentially. And you need to remove or disable unnecessary firewall rules quickly. So building in a process for regularly reviewing those firewall configurations and those rules and making sure that you're getting rid of any that you don't need anymore. So all fine and dandy, you might think, but what about where your workers are not sat on top of the hill anymore with a nice moat around them? What if they're in a coffee shop on public Wi-Fi? What if they're accessing IaaS, PaaS or SaaS services in the cloud? How can you meet the firewall requirements of Cyber Essentials in those situations? And at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Andre from Netscope, who's going to talk you through exactly how you can do just that. Over to you, Andre.
Thanks, Claire, and hello, everyone. Let me share my screen. So hopefully you can actually see that by now. If not, please let me know, because that's
Yeah, you're all good. Thank you.
that's the first stage. So a little bit about myself. So I started, like many people on this call and probably in this industry, as a network and security engineer. So worked at a few major, let's call it networking vendors, moved along the industry for a few years there. And my last one was Microsoft before joining Netscope. So I've done the travel, and I've probably done the evolution with the industry along the years as well. Um, I've actually read the Cyber Essentials requirements as well, and I have to say it broke my heart a little bit when I saw the sections. It was firewalls and then something else, and I was wondering the same, like you mentioned, what happens when you're not on the hill, you're not inside that perimeter? What happens then? So in other words, how about the cloud, right? And the cloud services? Because as you probably realize by now, we're using loads of those. And even if traditionally, let's say there was an exchange on premise or something like that, everything is now moved to the cloud. So it kind of begs the question, right? How are we going to make sure that we are Cyber Essentials compliant by obviously addressing those cloud challenges? So that's what we're going to talk about now, and hopefully it will make more sense. So as I said earlier, I was reading this requirement myself, and there was one phrase that sort of caught my eye, right? And it says that for cloud services, you can achieve this using data flow policies. So then I started wondering, what do they actually mean by that? Um, and what I believe they mean by that is something like this, just to give you an example here, right? So I've got my user, and then I've got any other logins that he's used, and then the services that he's using, right? So you probably see here, most of this, actually all of it, in fact, is cloud services. So we have WeTransfer, which obviously our user likes to use a lot. I'm not sure the business likes that, but then we have some Microsoft 365, we have Google Workspace, Box, and many others, right? And then we can see at what's going on. So what type of account he's using, what is he actually doing on those applications? Is he browsing? Is he uploading data? Or doing something else, sharing data for that matter, right? So this is an example of a data flow, or as many of you may recognize, a session, right? Because that could be another word for flow, right? So we have a session between the user and the application, and there's a lot of detail in here on what that user is actually doing in there, right? And this particular type of detail is very hard to get on a firewall. In fact, I would say it's nearly impossible to get this level of detail on a traditional sort of boundary, sort of perimeter firewall, right? And I think it kind of requires a new approach to it. And again, it's not saying you have to replace the firewall, it's saying you have to keep the firewall, but also think about what you can add to it to make it compliant on that firewall section, right? So let's try and find out. So there's a few policies there, just an example. We'll go through this in a second, don't worry about it. But you've got justifications for those actions. Could be a policy, right? Ask someone to provide a justification on their action, or step up the authentication, or even block their action completely, right? So this is quite interesting one, but we'll go into that in a second. So don't worry about it. But before we do that, let's have a look at how it all sort of began. So let's go back a little bit. The way we built networks so far, the way I built networks until maybe, what, 7, 8 years ago, or what I like to call pre-COVID period, because that's when things kind of changed dramatically, right? Until then, loads of companies that I've worked with in the past, especially in finance and insurance and sectors like that, had people working from the office 5 days a week. As you probably realize now, that's not the case anymore. Even those customers have changed, those organizations have changed, and they allow a flexible or a hybrid workforce, right? Allowing people to work from home a little bit more. But traditionally, the way we built things was kind of like this, right? You had people in the office, you had your data center, your apps in the data center, and that was kind of it. What happened though? We started adding more things to it. We've started using more cloud apps, more web apps. We've actually migrated some of these apps into the public cloud. So things like AWS, Azure, or we've just started using all sorts of random apps. I don't have that in my deck, but there's stats around how many apps an organization has or people use. And I can tell you it's thousands, right? We run a shadow IT assessment as well, and it's always in the thousands, right? Despite what people think. Because think about it, on your phone, how many apps do you have, right? So it's valid for the organizations at work as well. And then we've added loads of users. We allow people to use their own devices. We allow people to work from home, as I like to call the branch of one, right? Um, People working from coffee shops and holidays and by the pool or wherever they are. Obviously, I'm taking it to extreme now, but we've also have remote branches and IoT devices and everything else. And what they all have in common is that they kind of go on their own. So quite often that flow, that session, that traffic does not pass through the firewall, right? And this is a mess, and it's deliberately a mess, so don't try to make any sense of it. But it is what it is, right? You have application talking to other applications. You've got users not on the VPN, which means you can't see any of their traffic. And it's a mess. You've lost the visibility. You've lost the ability to create any flow or data flow policies on that, right? So I think this is where we start sort of asking ourselves, how do we make this better? How do we make this more efficient, right? One way to do this is to add a secure web gateway technology. Reason for this is it's quite hard to achieve all of that on an existing on-premise firewall. Just to give an example, and I'll add some characteristics here. Decrypting traffic, right? Web traffic, everything that we do today, it's HTTPS. Even if you are passing everything to the firewall, if you don't decrypt it, you still can't see it, right? So you still can't see what's in there. So even if you say, right, I'm gonna just stick with the firewall, I'm gonna take all the boxes in Cyber Essentials, maybe, but you can't actually analyze that traffic, right? So in order to be, I think, fully compliant, you need to look into what's going on in there. One way to do it is decrypting the traffic, right? Doing that on a firewall takes a low processing power. So many people don't actually do it. And that's why something like Secure Web Gateway will take that load away, right? So that's one thing. And I was saying earlier, it does not actually replace the firewall. It works alongside it. So that's the point I want to make. So don't chuck away your firewall and put this in. They work together, right? There are use cases where obviously this could do that too, but we'll keep this call short, right? We'll keep that for another call. And then you need to look at how we can restrict those flows. And you've seen the picture earlier with that user and that nice graph and showing what he's doing and what apps. And we can use something called zero trust, which I'm sure you've heard about it by now many, many times. If you've been to InfoSec a few weeks ago, it was all about that. I'll go to that in a second, but basically, what does that mean in short is you don't give people access to everything, you give them access per session, right? So per flow. And we'll look at that in a second, as I said. And then you need to add advanced threat. Yep.
I was just going to ask on that front, actually, sure. If you could just explain the advantages of Secure Web Gateway from that point of view over, for example, a next-gen firewall that has some web gateway capabilities within it?
Absolutely. Great question. Yeah, one of the things I said earlier, right, is the ability to decrypt traffic and analyze and do deep inspection of that encrypted traffic. I think that's one of the main ones. If you think about it, the hardware of a firewall, it's a fixed sort of unit, right? Our traffic demand, our bandwidth grows exponentially every year, right? We have better cameras, we've got better pictures that we put in our slides, right? Better memes. Those take space. So all the stuff that we share just gets larger and larger and larger, right? So that bandwidth is actually getting larger, and the box isn't, it's fixed. So being able to decrypt that traffic with something that sits on a cloud, which is what Netscope, for instance, is, and I'll talk about it in a second, it allows you to scale and do this a lot more effective, let's say, and cost effective at the same time, right? That's one thing. And then the ability to apply these zero trust controls for that data flow traffic, again, is one of them. A lot of the the traditional firewalls can actually do that. They cannot differentiate between, let's say, my personal OneDrive or the corporate OneDrive or another corporate OneDrive or even G Suite, right? It's gsuite.com. How would you know if it's our G Suite, your own G Suite, or someone else's, right? There's many use cases around that, and I'll mention that as well. And I would say those two are the sort of major ones I can think of at the moment, right? Again, there's plenty of benefits of doing this thing. You can coach the users as well, but it reduces complexity a lot. You've seen the picture earlier, right? It was a bit of a mess. Having something that can steer the traffic, especially web traffic, to a secure web gateway helps with that and helps reduce risk and obviously reduce cost. And it's one of the things that's connected to what I said earlier, right? You're moving some of this high load, like decryption of web traffic, onto a secure web gateway, which will decrease the cost, obviously, of a firewall, right? And it will make it more and more efficient for you as well in terms of user performance, but also in terms of security. That's very important. How are we doing on time? Okay, I need to speed up a little bit now. Right, I talked a lot about this zero trust policy engine, and again, we're looking back at that data flow policy that was mentioned in the Cyber Essentials, right? How are we going to make that work? Well, one way to do it is through zero trust policy enforcement. So what does that actually mean in practice? Well, we identify who the user is, what type of device they're on, and then where are they, right? Are they on the home office? Is a location that we trust? Have they logged in from a new location that we perhaps don't trust? They haven't logged in from there, which increases the risk, obviously. What application is it? Is it OneDrive? Is it WeTransfer that we shouldn't really allow or we allow? And then we need to look further. We need to look at, okay, so it's OneDrive, but what OneDrive? Is it our own OneDrive? Is it someone else's OneDrive? Or is it the personal instance, right? Again, think about it. Someone's leaving the organization tomorrow and they want to copy some data with them, which clearly they shouldn't. The ability to identify which instance they're connected to is quite important. I'll give an example. On my laptop, I have my personal OneDrive syncing as well, because all my photos for my phone go in there. And then I also have my corporate OneDrive as well, right, syncing, but only that company files go in there. It's very important to make sure that those two don't cross, right? And this is one way to do it. And then you can look at, obviously, like I said earlier, what type of data, and then you can make a decision. Are we going to allow it? Are we going to block it? Or are we going to coach the user, right? And say, you know what? We'll allow the use of this app, but make sure that what you put in there is actually the company's data, right? Or sorry, if it's a personal, obviously you don't want to put that, but make sure that what you put in there does not breach the company policy. You can apply this to cloud apps as well. One of the very popular ones that I talk a lot today, generative AI, ChatGPT, Copilot, everybody talks about it, and everybody wants to find a way to make sure that what goes in there doesn't actually contradict the company policy. So you're trying to copy and paste something into ChatGPT, for instance. Again, you can pop up a screen. Hey, your action contradicts Employee Handbook 1.3. Make sure that what you're putting in there is actually according to that policy. Would you like to proceed? And then you make the user aware of their actions, right? The reason I like this approach more is that when you block someone from doing something, they'll just find an alternative way. And that's, again, we go back to the previous mess slide, which shows a lot of errors that bypass all your security. So this is, I think, the more efficient way of doing it. So yeah, if we think about securing data flows, I think this is probably the best way to do it. And yeah, hopefully if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer. One way to do it with Netscope, obviously, because I work for Netscope, is to use our platform. So the Netscope one, we call it one because it's literally one client, one gateway, and one policy engine. Depending what you're doing, doesn't matter, it's still one policy. And it's cloud-delivered servers, and I'll go to that in a second. So you don't have to deploy any appliances, you don't have to deploy any boxes. All you have to do It's send the traffic to us and we'll do all the work. So all the policy engine and everything else sits in a cloud, which we built, and that's it, right? You don't have to do too much from an architectural perspective. Even if the user, let's say, goes from home to the office, the Netscope client on the machine senses that's in the office, and you can then direct the traffic to us through an IPsec tunnel, for instance, from your firewall. So you have the same consistent policy across any sort of medium, right, if you want. So it doesn't matter where the user is, security stays the same, right? And that's what we want. Again, happy to talk more about this, but we'll leave that for another call. All right, I've talked about the Netscope Cloud, so normally I get questions like, oh, but hold on a minute, how about data sovereignty? How about that? Where's your data center? All over the place. We have 74 regions. One region has multiple data centers. That's why we only call it a region. London has 3, for instance. Manchester has 2. Just to give you an example, right? We only counted 1. It doesn't make sense to call it different since they're all in the same place. And again, we have quite a wide coverage. And the most important thing here, we have full compute on every single one of them. In other words, it doesn't matter where you're connecting from, you're going to get the same capability. Whether it's data loss prevention policies, threat protection, you name it, decryption, it happens everywhere. And we're not going to charge you extra for let's say, decryption in a different location. Or you want to create data loss prevention policies in, I don't know, Montreal, we're not going to charge you extra for that. It's going to be the same, right? So you're licensed to use all of those wherever you are as a user. That's the point I'm trying to make. And again, I'm not saying it's the best solution out there. Maybe it's not, but if more people, there's a saying, right? If someone says something, ignore them. If 2 people say the same thing, maybe try to look at them. If 3 people say the same thing, maybe you should believe them, right? But there's more people saying that we're actually a really good solution, and they've marked us accordingly. So yeah, I'm probably the slides will be shared anyway, so I'm not going to dive too much into this, so we can have some time for questions. But yeah, that's it for me. Thank you very much. We worked very closely with Sapio. It's been a pleasure to be on the call, and yeah, look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks so much, Andre. Yeah, we've got a couple of minutes actually if people have questions that they want answered. Temi, I think you'd put in the chat, it's Netscope owned by Sapio. No, it's not. They're one of our vendor partners. But yeah, has anybody else got any questions that they'd like to ask? Please feel free to come off mute if you just want to speak, or you can pop it in the chat or Q&A if you prefer. Failing that, if you'd rather speak to your account manager after the webinar, then please feel free to reach out that way as well. But we'll be here for the next 5 minutes to answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, exactly. If anyone wants to follow up, wants to know more about Netscope, what does it actually do? What's this secure gateway thing? How does it work with what I have now? I'm very happy to answer those questions. It's conversations that we have on a daily basis. As I said, I come from a firewall-only world, and I've discovered that it's not enough actually to make a sort of a full security environment. So that's why you kind of need to look other things as well to complement that these days, especially when traffic bypasses that, right? That's the thing. Oh, Alex got a question.
I just wanted to say that I've turned on the mics and the camera for everyone if you do want to ask a question now. I'm Alex from the marketing team at Sapio, by the way. We'll be sending out a recording of this tomorrow along with the slides from your Sapio account manager. So if you've got any questions that you want to follow up with, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Looks like we haven't got any questions today, so I think we'll wrap up and watch out for the email from us tomorrow. Thank you very much, Andre and Claire.
Pleasure.
You're welcome. Pleasure.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you.